Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. So here's a question to think about. Why does a single editorial mistake, even one the broadcaster admits to, like editing a presidential speech, why does that lead so quickly to the resignation of two top executives? I mean, is that level of reaction a sign of, a really deep institutional failure? Or is it maybe just high political drama playing out? We're going to explore the recent crisis at the BBC. This followed the pretty extraordinary resignations back on November 9th, 2025, of the Director General Tim Davie and the new CEO Deborah Turnus. And for you listening, the key isn't just what mistake happened. It's more about what this whole moment reveals about the future, really, of public service broadcasting when the world feels so polarized and that middle ground seems to be, vanishing. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The immediate thing, the proximate cause, was an episode of Panorama, the BBC's long-running investigative show. And this specific documentary had an edited clip of Donald Trump's speech from January 6, 2021.
That's right. And the technicality of the edit is quite crucial here. It wasn't minor. The BBC itself later called it a serious error of judgment. Essentially, the producers took two completely separate remarks from different points in that long speech
and spliced them together.
Exactly. They took the part where Trump suggested supporters walk down to the Capitol, and they immediately followed it with a different phrase, and we fight like hell.
Right. So putting those together makes it sound like one continuous thought.
Precisely. It gives this really strong, and you could say highly inflammatory impression that he was directly calling for violent action right then and there. The BBC had to concede later that, yes, this editing misrepresented the original speech.
And the political reaction, I imagine it was pretty swift.
Oh, instant and, frankly, brutal.
Yeah.
Especially from the political right.
The White House weighed in?
They did. The press secretary labeled the BBC a 100% fake news. And Trump himself, well, he saw a huge PR win, didn't he? He went on social media, claimed victory, said the top people were quitting fired for being caught doctoring his, quote, very good perfect speech.
Classic Trump.
Indeed. But, stepping back a bit, that edit, the Trump speech edit, it was really the catalyst, the sort of public trigger. It wasn't the sole cause of the resignations.
You mean there was more going on behind the scenes?
Yes, exactly. This crisis had been brewing internally. There were growing complaints, particularly from the right, about systemic bias. The edit just brought it all to a head publicly.
And how do we know about these internal issues? Was it leaks?
Precisely. There was that internal memo, quite revealing, written by Michael Prescott, who used to be a standards advisor at the BBC. And this memo alleged what he called serious and systemic editorial failings. And crucially, it wasn't just about Trump or U.S. politics. It covered several really sensitive areas.
Like what specifically within the UK context as well?
Well, the memo highlighted flawed coverage related to the Trump era, yes, but also the Gaza-Israel conflict, which is incredibly sensitive, and also domestic UK coverage of transgender issues. And importantly, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The BBC had already had a few other quite public and embarrassing breaches recently that were damaging its credibility.
Right. I remember something about the Glastonbury Music Festival.
That's the one. The BBC's own complaints unit found they had broken editorial guidelines by broadcasting a performance which included chants of death to the IDF. Very explicit.
Wow.
And then there was another, maybe even stranger case where Ofcom, the UK regulator, stepped in. They ruled the BBC committed a serious breach because they didn't disclose that the narrator of a documentary about Gaza was actually the son of a senior Hamas official.
So these weren't just small slip-ups. They sound like failures of process, maybe even culture.
I think that's fair. Failures of disclosure, failures of editorial judgment. They certainly fed into this narrative that there might be a deeper cultural issue around impartiality.
Okay, so when you see that pattern emerging, repeated issues with disclosure or perceived neutrality, it really raises the stakes for an organization like the BBC, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Probably more so than for a private news outlet.
Absolutely. It goes right to the core of what public service broadcasting is. These institutions, their entire legitimacy rests on the claim of impartiality and accuracy. That's their currency, especially internationally. So when a single high-profile mistake like the Trump edit can be used to challenge that fundamental claim, it becomes an existential threat. It undermines the whole basis for the institution's existence.
And that fragility, that vulnerability, it must be massively amplified by the way the BBC is funded in the UK.
Oh, completely. The compulsory license fee. That's the unique factor here. Right now, it's £174.50 for about 230 LS.
And everyone who watches live TV or BBC iPlayer has to pay it by law.
Exactly. It's a system that inevitably creates political friction that private companies like, say, Netflix or Sky News just don't face. And think about the irony, just for a second. That fee, £174.50, is actually enough to pay for a basic Netflix and a basic Disney Plus subscription, and you'd still have a bit left over.
Huh. Never thought of it like that.
But because the public is legally forced to pay, whether they watch the BBC or not, the demand for absolute transparency, for accountability, it just goes through the roof. It becomes a political necessity.
So if you can't just cancel your subscription when you're unhappy,
Then every single perceived mistake, especially one seen as biased, carries enormous political weight. It puts the whole compulsory funding model under the microscope every single time.
which must make navigating these controversies incredibly difficult for the leadership.
Extremely. And connecting this back to the bigger picture, all these recent crises, the edit, the Glastonbury incident, the narrator issue, the whistleblower memo, they dramatically increase the governance risk for the BBC. Its independence, that license fee model, even the renewal of its royal charter, which is due in 2027. These are now major political battlegrounds. The resignations just poured gasoline on that fire, raising the stakes for 2027 significantly.
This makes me wonder, though, is the BBC even structurally set up to succeed in today's media world? I mean, the way you describe it, the whole media business seems to be pushing in the opposite direction of the BBC's mission.
That's a fundamental tension, yes. The digital media landscape, driven by algorithms and subscription models, it actively rewards polarization. Content that's edgy, polarizing, easily shareable, that travels faster and further on social media than nuanced, balanced reporting. News outlets everywhere are increasingly finding they need to cater to what their specific audience wants to hear, just to keep them engaged and paying.
Right, which is the exact opposite of the BBC's mandate, to serve everyone, regardless of their political views.
Precisely. It's a direct conflict. And you see this tension play out when the BBC tries to do more analytical or perhaps opinionated content.
Like that Americast podcast example.
That's a perfect case study. They try to be relevant, maybe a bit edgy, analyzing U.S. politics, but they titled an episode asking if America's health secretary was, quote, a danger to public health.
Oof, that's quite pointed.
It is. And by framing it that way, even if the content inside was balanced, they immediately alienate a large part of the potential audience who just want impartial facts, not what feels like an editorialized question. It shows how hard it is to find that middle ground when every single choice is scrutinized for bias.
So if that political center ground is shrinking, as many argue it is, and the BBC is supposed to occupy that space, well, the problem seems almost structural, baked into the current environment.
I think that's right. And that shrinking center is mirrored in Britain's own changing political divides. For years, the main split was class, right? Working class versus middle class. The BBC, with its generally middle-class, London-centric staff, was arguably quite well suited to that landscape.
But that's not the main dividing line anymore.
Not really. It's shifted. Now, the major divides seem to be much more about age and geography.
How so? Do we have data on that?
Yes, the figures are quite stark. Take Reform UK, that insurgent right-wing party. It gets huge support, around 35% from people over 65. But among 18 to 24-year-olds, it's only about 8%. A massive age gap.
Wow. And how does the BBC's own workforce map onto that?
Well, that's where the potential disconnect becomes clear. Roughly 70% of the BBC staff are under 50, and a large proportion are based in London.
So demographically, the organization itself looks quite different from significant parts of the audience, particularly older, more rural, perhaps more right-leaning segments.
Exactly. It makes it inherently harder, structurally harder, for the organization to genuinely connect culturally and politically with those audiences who increasingly feel that the metropolitan elite media doesn't represent or understand them. This mismatch fuels the perception of bias.
And you can actually see that perception in the trust statistics, can't you? Which must be worrying for the BBC.
Very worrying. Overall, the BBC is still a relatively trusted brand compared to some others. But when you break it down by political leaning, the gap is huge.
What do the numbers show?
Okay, so around 67% of people who identify as left-wing or centrist say they trust BBC News, which is pretty good. But among those who identify as right-wing, that trust level drops dramatically down to just 47%.
A 20-point difference. That's significant.
It really is. And it gives measurable weight to the claims you hear, especially on the right, that the BBC is essentially a leftist propaganda machine. And adding insult to injury for them, it's one they're forced to pay for through the license fee.
Okay, this is where I think we need to maybe challenge the simple narrative. It's easy to focus on the drama, the resignations, the doctored speech, and frame it all as one big, egregious mistake. But what if that's missing the bigger picture? What if that editing error wasn't the core problem, but actually just a very public symptom of deeper, more structural vulnerabilities within the BBC?
I think that's exactly the right way to look at it. Focusing only on the high-level drama, the resignations of Davy and Turnus, it kind of obscures those potentially deeper issues in the editorial culture, the oversight processes, the overall governance. It lets the institution say, look, heads rolled, accountability happened, and move on.
But hang on, isn't that what accountability is? I mean, surely when mistakes this big happen, the people at the top have to go.
Well, it's certainly the most visible form of accountability, and maybe the easiest. But think about it. If the underlying culture doesn't change, if the processes for checking complex edits aren't fixed, if whistleblower concerns aren't properly addressed, if the board's oversight isn't effective, then the same kind of problems could just happen again, but with different people in charge.
Exactly. We've seen various crises flare up over the years. This pattern suggests the vulnerability might lie less with specific individuals and more within the system itself. Replacing the leaders might just be treating the symptom, not the disease. Which brings us to perhaps the thorniest question of all for the BBC and maybe for all public broadcasters today. How do you actually do impartiality? How is it defined? Who decides what's fair when the different political sides can't even agree on basic facts anymore?
That is the absolute core dilemma. The BBC is trying to occupy this neutral, central ground, right? But what happens when that center ground seems to be eroding or maybe even disappearing altogether? In that kind of hyper-polarized environment, almost any editorial decision choosing who narrates a documentary, how you edit a soundbite, what question you ask in a podcast title, it instantly gets magnified, picked apart, and often weaponized by critics looking to prove bias. It feels like an almost impossible tightrope walk.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit towards the future then, because there's a fascinating political paradox here that might, strangely enough, help the BBC survive, despite all this criticism.
Yes, the sort of Auntie factor, as it's sometimes called. You have politicians, particularly on the right, like Nigel Farage, who constantly attack the BBC, threatening to overhaul its funding or structure.
It's a very popular line of attack for them.
Extremely popular. But here's the kicker, as you said, a paradox. The very people who are most likely to watch the BBC regularly are often the same demographic groups who support those critical politicians.
You mean the over 65s again?
Precisely. The data shows that over 65s, the group most likely to back parties like Reform UK, also spend, on average, about 5 hours a day watching traditional television. And a huge amount of that viewing is BBC content.
So bashing the BBC plays well politically.
Yes, it's effective political theater.
But actually getting rid of it, or fundamentally changing it, especially getting rid of popular shows like Strictly Come Dancing or The Traitors or David Attenborough documentaries.
That could be incredibly unpopular with the very voters those politicians need. Dismantling Auntie carries a significant political risk.
It's a real contradiction.
It is, and it means that while the BBC is definitely wounded politically right now, it still holds this deep cultural resonance and reach in British life that few other institutions possess. The challenge is leveraging that cultural capital into genuine institutional reform before that 2027 charter review deadline looms too large.
So if the BBC is going to navigate that charter review successfully and rebuild trust across the board, what are the key things we, and you listening, should be watching for? What would real change look like?
Well, it needs to go way beyond just changing the names on the doors of the top offices. We need evidence of deep structural shifts. I'd say there are 4 key areas to monitor. First, process reform. Are they genuinely strengthening the checks and balances, especially for complex things like documentary edits? Are the public correction protocols becoming faster and more transparent? They simply cannot afford more repeats of the Trump edit or the Gaza narrator fiasco.
Makes sense. What's second?
Second, funding legitimacy. They have to tackle the license fee head on. As more and more younger people consume media digitally and perhaps don't watch traditional BBC channels, the political justification for forcing everyone to pay gets weaker every year. They need serious, credible proposals for reform.
Okay, process and funding. What about the core issue of bias?
Third, impartiality mechanisms. Their internal complaints units are often dismissed by critics as the BBC marking its own homework. To regain trust, especially on the right, they probably need to establish a more credible, maybe truly independent body that can assess claims of bias transparently and authoritatively.
And the fourth area?
Fourth is their digital strategy. The BBC is competing globally now, particularly in audio and streaming, against giants like Spotify, Netflix, Amazon. How do they compete effectively on that stage without compromising their core public service values and editorial standards domestically, just to chase clicks or views? Global actions have domestic consequences now.
So wrapping this up, the real takeaway isn't just about a botched edit or executive resignations. This whole episode is a pretty stark wake-up call, isn't it?
I think so. It shows that even a massive, long-established institution like the BBC with a century of history is really vulnerable to these shifting audience expectations, demographic changes, the polarizing pull of the digital media economy.
And true resilience, long-term survival, isn't just about swapping leaders. It's about fundamental structural adaptation.
Exactly.
Which leaves us and you with the final thought. If that political center ground really is gone or fundamentally changed, can an institution like the BBC, funded by everyone and mandated to serve everyone, actually survive in its current form? Or is the very idea of true universal impartiality becoming impossible in our hyperpolarized age? Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.